Great, thanks so much, Jack. Thanks everybody for joining today. Obviously the topic is open source. We'll get into that in just a moment. But first I would like to introduce the co-panelists here and a little bit about how I believe they touch open source. So first we have Rudy Guyon. Rudy is Lead Enterprise Product Counsel at McAfee. And so he's thinking about open source from the in-house product strategy and risk management and compliance functions at a large enterprise technology company and consumer technology company. Indira Bhatt, next. Indira is an open source software technical and strategy consultant, works with a whole lot of different companies and probably spends more of her day dealing with open source singularly than anybody else on this panel. So great to have you today, Indira. Widely mistaken for a lawyer, but is not, but that tells you something about the importance of the legal components of open source. My colleague, Michelle Narganis. Michelle is a technology transactions and corporate lawyer at Crowell and Mooring. So she manages open source transactions and deals with open source issues as they arise in venture, M&A deals, and diligence projects. And I'm an intellectual property and technology lawyer, so I deal with open source primarily through the lens of IP and the way that open source issues connect with other forms of legal protection and strategy. So with that background, just so you know a little about who we are, I think the goal today is to, at least at the highest level, is to try to present, get in a little bit of conversation about open source that is more about the business orientations around open source, how companies can really proactively and affirmatively engage with open source licenses or open source projects, and just think a little bit about the way that one can build value and maybe some of the barriers to accomplishing that in any company or any technology project. I think maybe the way to start is I'd like to get the group's reactions about, just from down in the street, if you will, from your respective different types of roles. How do you, what is the view of open source broadly from the business and technology stakeholders that you encounter about open source? You can start anywhere. Why don't we start with you, Rudy?
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. So I'd say two things. One is the big change over time. Some of you may have started seeing open source around, getting more and more popular a couple of decades ago, actually. And back then, open source was something to be avoided. It was seen as forbidding, too risky, can't use it. And now it's widely seen as something that's very valuable and companies should embrace it. And so I wanted to talk about all the great opportunities that we see from using open source, not just in my current company, but in the last few companies I've worked at. So one thing to talk about would be the employees. Like, many employees are demanding that companies engage with open source because they want to participate in open source communities to build professional skills, build their reputations, and do their jobs better. And then the companies are now using open source to achieve many different business goals. One might be building the company's reputation in open source communities and attracting employees, for example, or utilizing the high quality functional open source code that exists already to lower costs or increase efficiency or speed up projects or overcome engineering shortages. There's a whole bunch of things that I could list. There's benefits of crowdsourcing, competing against other companies that are using open source to lower their costs, et cetera, and integrating. I think integration of projects that have common code bases is really important. Companies are increasingly using or participating in open source projects to achieve their goals, such as managing their own code or updating their code or integrating it, or even developing, a standard or leveraging a standard. Maybe I should just stop there, Gabe, and let some of the other people jump in.
That's all fabulous, and we're going to riff on pieces of that in a little bit. That's a pretty optimistic and positive sort of message about open source.
Yeah,
in general,
I think
in broad terms, I would say.
We find ways to manage the risks because there's so many benefits. I mean, I have a list twice that long of potential benefits. There's just so much. I mean, if you think about it, there's just great code out there, and why rewrite it again if you can use it effectively? There doesn't seem to be many good reasons to spend all the time redoing it. And whether you can duplicate how good it is, and the crowdsourcing really does seem to produce a lot of benefits. Experts using the code and finding better ways to write it and adapting it for different use cases. It's really quite astounding.
Super. Indira, why don't we shift to you again? Sort of, you're primarily in a technical role. You're engaged with business and technical stakeholders. Just high-level reactions, level of literacy. Where are we from your day-to-day view?
Yeah, so I think, thanks, Gabe. So I think I started, my first stint with open source was when I was a developer, right? So I used open source software to avoid reinventing the wheel, right? So I don't have to rewrite anything from scratch, and it was easy. And and I have to say, I never paid attention to licensing. I had no idea what license I was using, right? So fast forward 10 years, here I am doing, licensing for the most part. So I think even as a personal example, the open source adoption has changed from 10 years ago until now. A decade ago, I was a part of a services team in a scanning company, right, that made tools for open source scanning. And we'd see, maybe a standard output of somebody's code base or product would produce, a 10 to 100 open source components, right? That was the standard. And you'd have a couple under copyleft licenses, and majority of them would be under permissive licenses. But fast forward to today, the scope has just bombarded, right? The outputs of open source are basically 70 to 80% open source, and your proprietary code is around 20 to 30%, right? So the outputs that you see today are up to thousands. So that's the usage these days. And the focus no longer is on the usage, right? Everybody's using it, but the focus right now is on managing it and leveraging it correctly, and also making sure that you give attribution to the open source that you're using. So that's one of the things that I see constantly, that people love using it, but they also want to make sure that they're using it correctly and give attribution to all those great open source projects that you are using to build your own product, right? So those are a few of the things I see day to day.
Super. Just a quick follow-up on one point. Those are striking numbers in terms of percentage open source components compared to proprietary components. When you start with working with a new company or stakeholders, do you think that most folks you're dealing with, whether it's the technical stakeholders or business stakeholders, are aware that much of many projects and efforts are open source to begin with?
It depends on the company, right? So I think if it's a small company, they might not be that aware of their open source adoption, because they're not used to scanning, they're not used to looking at exactly what is getting pulled in. But the bigger companies are very much in tune with, okay, this is what we're using, and these they know what's going on for the most part, right? So I think the surprises are where it's you build fast and you're small and you're trying to get up and going, and you're using stuff to just make to do the next release, right? You want to get your software out there. So those are where the surprises come in, that you don't have a process of intake of open source. You don't know what you're using. So I see that there, but not so much. It's always surprising to find certain things, right, that you didn't know you were using. So that's always there. But yeah.
Great. Maybe extend a point there to you, Michelle. Well, you mentioned small companies. So, Michelle, this is kind of a universe, your universe, right? Emerging companies, startups. Do you agree, disagree? What kind of perspective do you see down there in the street as a tech transaction and really venture lawyer? Reactions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to sort of tie some of Rudy's points and Indira's points together, I think, 10 years ago, early stage companies were maybe not as comfortable using open source because they were concerned about what investors or potential acquirers would think about them utilizing open source in their code, right? And on the acquisition side or the investor side, you would want reps and saying no open source, and we need to do a black duck scan, and we need to understand what's in there, because the assumption was that any open source was sort of bad and there were risks involved with that, and it was something to mitigate and protect against. And I think what we've seen now is, there's a growing understanding in the venture and acquirer world of all the nuances around open source, that the utilization of permissible licenses is not something to be fearful of, sort of in the same way that you might be fearful of a copyleft license. And so I think you see sort of a growing comfort and a willingness to, it's no longer a deal breaker or a concern in how companies are growing. And I think, to Rudy's point, there's, and Indira's point as well, these early stage companies that might have younger founders are much more comfortable in using open source in their code. It's part of sort of their lingo and how they want to develop their work. And so I think it's absolutely, something that's continuing to be used in new and interesting ways. And sort of my job as a tech transactions lawyer is to sort of make sure that that the licenses are being used correctly and effectively, and that if there's any building upon that open source or ways of sort of controlling that open source that starts to look a little bit more proprietary, that we're protecting that effectively as well.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you all for setting the table. This is an ACC event. Let's get into the law. So we grapple in preparing for today how much in the weeds to get. Open source licenses are very diverse and varied, and it can, a lot of times when you think about those legal issues, take on the quality of pouring over sacred tomes, maybe a little as much religion as law. But for today's purposes, I'm going to reduce open source licenses down to 3 basic buckets, and we can get into more detail if participants have questions or we get there. So for today's purposes, let's think of open source licenses as kind of 3 categories. One is permissive licenses. So I'm going to characterize permissive licenses as those that basically, they're permissive. They allow you to do many things with code that's licensed under a permissive license. So this is things like Apache or BSD or MIT licenses for those keeping score. So you can do a lot with it, and there's very few limitations or requirements, obligations that go with that permission. Generally, it's more nuanced than this, but you have to give attribution. You can't bind the providers to warranties. There's disclaimer of warranties, and often not much more than that. Category 2 at the other end of the spectrum are what I often call strong copyleft licenses. These are licenses that, the dreaded viral license. So the long and the short of it is code that is subject to a strong copyleft license. Anything that is a modification of it that's distributed or a derivative work of it must also be subject to that same license. And there the trick is, under these licenses and interpretations, often the interpretation of what is a derivative work can be quite broad in theory. So maybe code that interacts with code that is subject to a strong copyleft license must also be licensed. And then there's kind of a weaker copyleft category of license in the middle, that it's the same sort of questions and obligations to relicense code under this copyleft license. But I think the long and the short of it is those places where how we interpret modifications or derivative works may be narrower. So those are the buckets. Forget particular licenses. With those basic categories in mind, maybe Indira, we can launch off with you. Do you think that those folks who are developing a business strategy around a software product are thinking about how might we use affirmatively this, one of these buckets of licenses, or is literacy relatively low?
Yeah, I think it's always a good idea to kind of figure out what you want the future to look like for your product, right? So say I want to release something as an open source product. Is the long-term goal to release it commercially, right? What is the reason for doing this? I think there the clarity sometimes might be missing, is what I've seen, is that, you want to open source it to drive adoption, right? But you also want to sell the software for commercial purposes, right? So the reason behind open sourcing is, I think, the first thing that's kind of key to figure out what kind of licensing strategy you're going to use ultimately, right? Um, the most popular licenses seem to be the permissive licenses on GitHub, right? So they're the MIT, the BSD, and the Apache, right? So those licenses people use to drive adoption. So people are going to use your product if you're going to release this under these permissive licenses. But if you pick a more copyleft license or a strong copyleft license like the Affero or the GPL, then yeah, you're going to control the development more, but you're also going to lose adoption as well, right? So there's several aspects to this, and I think having a clear idea of what this is going to look like in the future um, is important. But having said that, I think there's plenty of examples where people change licensing all the time, right? As we've seen recently with Elastic and also Mongo.
Right. And let me just kind of fill out that story a little bit. We'll
Yeah.
stick with permissive licenses for a bit. What Inder's referring to is there's a kind of universe of very restrictive copyleft licenses that are used for servers. AGPL is the name of the license. And the idea here is that there's a couple of cloud services providers, broadly speaking, that have used this license for some time. But the problem is that at least from those companies' point of view, as they invest and grow and build these cloud services, even though folks who may otherwise be obliged to, if they modify that server-side code, to distribute it, to distribute the modifications, as a practical and technical matter, a competitor could take all that AGPL code, tilt it up in a server, and as a practical matter, it's just they've extracted the entire value of an ecosystem and can move customers over to their new copied ecosystem. And so we've seen some of these cloud providers basically create a new what they characterize as open source license that has many features of something like GPL that says, if you modify our code or use it, you have to continue to distribute under this license. But one big caveat, you cannot take our server-side code and tilt up a competing service, basically, which makes it very non-open source. So there's a lot of controversy around that. But I think the example is a good, really accentuates having a plan in place up front where you think you're going to go with an open source project. I think that's the point you just made. Rudy, maybe we can shift to you from a just broadly speaking, from an in-house role. Do you feel like the engineers or business stakeholders or product managers, any stakeholders, think far in advance about what open source licensing is an affirmative matter, or is it something that evolves in a different way?
Good question. I think that there's a huge difference between particular employees. Some engineers know this stuff like the back of their hand, and they're very adept at going out and finding code under licenses that they can use. And other engineers, not so much. And so there's definitely a role for the legal department in managing risks. And probably the big issue that we think about a lot is what are we going to do with the software, and what kind of license is it available under? Is it going to let us do what we need to do? And if we don't think we're it's going to let us do what we need to do, then we have to find a license in some way that does that, or find different code.
Have you, that's part of the equation, using open source components and products that are under development. Do you get requests from engineers to actively participate in broader open source projects, contribute back, that sort of thing? And if so, how does that take shape?
That's it's a constant desire, actually, of engineers that want to contribute and improve the projects they use. Or, there's also strategic reasons why a company might want to start an open source project or do a strategic alliance with other competitors and build a standard. Or, so this kind of stuff is growing all the time. And your question was, what kind of things do we think about, Gabe?
Yeah. If you're thinking about, you're faced with a request.
The most obvious one is, does the company want to maintain proprietary control, or does they want to put it out in open source where other companies can use it? And then if we put it out in open source, what are our business goals, and what kind of license, what kind of use do we want to allow? I mean, do we want to put it, a lot of code you can just put out under a permissive license. Especially you're just trying to improve something or give something out that you want your customers to use. That's really different than if you want to contribute something that your competitors might use. And then the strategy becomes, very different. Then you're trying to influence what the code base is out there, and you might have things in mind like how your product integrates with adjacent products, or if you're really ambitious, trying to create some kind of standard or just influence the direction of what software engineers are doing, because you see some strategic benefit from it.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that participating in open source projects that are more broadly based will allow a certain amount of insight into what the other participants are doing. Any observations from anybody about that?
Well, the one thing I would say is that, sometimes companies don't want to participate in a project if their competitors are going to develop a strong position in that, right? If they're going to get some leverage through their code, that does happen. But there are also reasons why it just can create so much efficiency that then it sort of becomes, well, what am I going to donate, and what kind of controls I'm going to have over it? I mean, so it depends on what's the license you attach to the code you donate. And if you actually structured the project or participating in it, you can do a lot of things like set a purpose for the project, or have different management techniques, or disclose some of what's necessary, but not all of it. There's a lot of strategy that goes on. And one thing I mentioned to you the other day was I was interested to find out some months ago that there are a lot of companies or organizations out there that can help businesses that are jumping into the open source project world and provide consulting and expert services. So, it's really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
and
sure.
I think, Gabe, just to sort of follow up on that, I think, from a legal perspective, and before I was at Crowell, I was in-house at a software company in San Francisco. And I think, from being the lawyer who might be involved in watching an open source project develop, or having a clear sort of understanding of what your company's product roadmap is and sort of go-to-market strategy and what you're ultimately trying to sort of monetize going forward is really important. Because I think, to Rudy's point, is it to be a good citizen to the community and standardize what everyone's using in a certain manner? Or are you really trying to utilize this project to in a more proprietary sense, and that's going to be impacted by the product roadmap? And so lawyers don't always like to hang out with the engineers or the developers, but taking the time to understand what they're thinking can help you sort of not be knocked back on your heels when they come to you and say, we have all this open source in our code, but we don't want anyone to use it. Or we want to give away all this work we did for free. And you're sort of like, wait, what? So I think sort of that, that in, you know, sort of those crossroads of being in-house and trying to be involved in what your developers and even your sales team is thinking about, or your product marketing team rather, is thinking about, can really help you both protect the company, but also effectively work with them to get to their, you know, to their next step in whatever open source project they're working on.
Great. I'm going to actually join a couple of questions in the comments and see if we can riff on those a little. So you know, there's a question about what are examples of strong copyleft, the most viral. It's a pejorative term, but maybe that's a way to think about it. So really anything with the word GPL in it, I think qualifies. So there's the basic GPL 2.0 or 3.0 licenses. There are AGPL, which is a kind of copyleft, strong copyleft license that I mentioned before, that really is for certain, you know, governs things like cloud services and considers providing a cloud service as a distribution that imposes these copyleft obligations. I mentioned SSPL before. I think there are some strong copyleft components of that. Those are really the key ones. And LGPL, which is this, that's another example of kind of a weaker copyleft license, just to provide some examples. But maybe extending a thought about any copyleft licenses, there's a question about actual enforcement. Who can enforce? Well, and this is true of any open source license. The bottom line is it's the copyright owner, the creator of that which is licensed, whether it's the original creator or somebody who has created a modification or a modified version and owns rights in that. So the core organizing principle of this whole regime is copyright law, really, at the end of the day. Sort of building on that question, I'd be curious for any of the panelists, have you been on the receiving end, managing the receiving end of an enforcement request or a complaint, or kind of preempting complaints, any sort of the tensions that come out of these strong copyleft licenses?
Well, I'll mention one without going into detail.
Mm-hmm.
We had a request to disclose code, right? Because that's what, you know, you have to share the code under that license. But in the case I was thinking about, we had used the copyleft license appropriately, and we did not think that there was any viral spreading, and that was our retort. So I use that to make the point that if you use the copyleft licensed code properly, you're not going to have it spread to code that you don't want it to spread to. It's when you make an error or are not aware of it that the problem comes up.
Right. Indira, Michelle, any thoughts about the tensions, you know, tense moments with open source? Let's broaden it out.
Yeah, the first question I'd like to add is some more info to that. So there's, I just shared a link on the chat. So that's the SPDX license list. So that basically, if you click on that, you'll see the most comprehensive license list there is, and people use this in many different companies. It's a licensing standard. So you will see the list of licenses there, and that's a good, I always still use it as a reference for open source licensing. So that's number one. And the second thing, your question about, you know, usage, and if that's come up, yeah, sure, right? That's that always happens. But I think the question that I always ask users of open source, people who are consuming it, is that, are you comfortable releasing this in source code form, right? And if you're not, then it's a big question, right? Like, what exactly are you doing with this? How are you using it? How is open source integrating with your core technology? So based on the licensing of the open source component, you might have to release your proprietary software for free, right? So I think the first question I always ask is, are you comfortable releasing this in source code form? And if the answer is yes, then you're good, right? You've got good practices, you're using it correctly. And if the answer is no, then yes, legal folk might have to get involved, right?
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that. There's, trying to keep broaden this conversation beyond pure risk management. The other side of that coin is I have been, in a couple of strategic conversations with clients where the thought was, if we release this in source code form, it's the kind of component in that context anyway, where a lot of competitors and maybe adjacent partners who might become competitors would need to basically use that code in some way or reuse it. And so in a couple of circumstances, I've seen companies very intentionally release some piece of their ecosystem that they think the competitor might be trying to use or need anyway, basically so they can keep an eye on them. And if it's in strong copyleft form, it does afford a kind of control where a competitor who's going to be manipulating or modifying some piece of your ecosystem that you've now licensed under GPL, there's, if they want to play in your sandbox at all, they got to take that license, which actually kind of cabins their ability to compete with you, which I found was, a pretty sophisticated view of open source. So I just offer that as a place where, it's something like GPL is like often like, oh gosh, I don't want to release, as you mentioned, are we comfortable putting our code out there in source? There may be times when that's a really strategic thing to do. So maybe that's the other side of the coin, and reasons to think ahead if you're a software company. There was a question broadly about developing an open source policy, that governs recommended license, required internal approvals, this sort of thing. Just structurally, any observations about the right level of granularity, detail, any facets of developing such a program?
I think it's absolutely necessary. I think it's the best practice. I think you need to know what code is in your code. There's a lot of exposures if you don't. And I mean, I'm not aware really of any companies that I've worked with that don't pay a lot of attention to it. I would think that software license compliance is, open source license compliance and just generally license compliance is probably one of the 2 or 3 most important legal things you can do as a vendor in the tech industry.
How do you drive engagement and education of the folks who need to know these things? What, just modally?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're doing with the code, right? But let's say you're making products and you're selling products and there's open source code in your products. Well, then you have like a product development lifecycle, and software license compliance would be part of that lifecycle. And so before you release the product, you're making sure that that product is meeting your licensing standards, and you know what IP's in there, and you're comfortable with the licenses, and the outbound license is not causing any conflict, because you don't want to have obligations like exposing your code to viral effects, or being exposed for an indemnity, or having an export problem, or anything like that.
Any to open it up to everybody here, tools, sort of resources out there that companies that want to manage this from a risk standpoint, a compliance standpoint, places that companies can turn. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think this has become something that a lot of people are doing, right? Open source compliance is part of your standard software release process these days. So there are a lot of tools and standards that are all open source. SPDX is one of them, right? And there's another called OpenChain, which is now an ISO standard. So OpenChain, for anyone who, I'll share a link as well. So basically that sets a standard for policies, training, and scanning and tooling, and basically everything compliance related for companies. So they give you a kind of a playbook that you can use and say that, what do I need to do to make sure that I am compliant, right? all the products that I have for distribution, I need to make sure that they have a current, say, bill of materials, right? All the developers that are in my company have a basic understanding of licensing, right? So those are the things that OpenChain kind of helps doing. And that's really available. It's all open source. It's all online. So people use that a lot. As far as scanning tools, there's many that are open source and many that are great. There's scan code, there's ORT, right? So there are a bunch of tools that are pretty good, and you can get your software bill of materials by running them on your product. And they're all open source, Apache licensed. So there's a lot being done in this space, and there's continuous improvement. And to you guys' point that it's all, they're all permissively, most of them are permissively licensed, right? So we're seeing a lot of development in that space.
Great. Michelle, that just triggered a thought. You mentioned VCs and companies alike are more and more comfortable seeing open source or thinking about open source in the context of funding and deals. Do you feel like there's sophistication in terms of how to manage the diligence process through technology tools or checklists, anything?
Sorry, couldn't get off mute there for a second. So as I mentioned before, black duck scans, you'll typically see those in more of an acquisition sense. But when it comes to, on the investment side, you're starting to see more in-depth technology diligence, right? Depending on the stage of funding. You might not see it in some of the early rounds, like a seed round or an A round, but the larger the rounds get and the more sophisticated the companies get, the more in-depth the diligence process will be. But I think the other part of it, and this sort of goes to Rudy's point, is all of these, whether it's an acquisition or an investment, they're going to be looking for reps and warranties from the companies related to their IP, right? That they can use it, that essentially that what's in there. And so you want to make sure that you can make those representations, because if you can't, if you make them and it comes back to haunt you, that's going to be a huge issue for the company, right? So, I think it's, while the diligence process in an investment side might not be that in depth, you're still making the representation. So you still need to make sure that that the company itself is doing its own diligence on whatever it's putting out there. And that, so while the comfort level with open source is increased, the level of the representations that are being required remain the same, which is, what you're doing and what you've produced, and what you own, or if you don't own it, you have the right to use it in your intellectual property. And that hasn't changed. And I think it requires increased diligence on the company's part to make, if there's increased use of open source, to really keep, make sure that they are on that, make sure that they are aware of every piece of open source that's in their code, right? You'll be required to usually that's a disclosure in any kind of an acquisition or a VC deal. It'll be part of what you disclose in your disclosure schedule. They'll want a list of every single piece of open source that's in your code. So, that to Rudy's point, I agree. I think it's one of the biggest pieces of internal, corporate compliance you can be doing if you are a technology company right now.
Great. From a risk standpoint, we've talked a little bit about, kind of focused on these highest risk GPL copyleft type licenses, and the fact that it, could potentially taint code that a company wanted to treat as proprietary if you're not careful. That is, from a compliance standpoint, to me, I think that's the basic issue that is in play. Permissive licenses on the other end of the spectrum, let's maybe tackle those just for a moment. These are the types of licenses you can do a lot, things like BSD or MIT or Apache. And they don't raise such red flags. If they show up in these kind of code modules or end up in the code, there are definitely obligations that go along with it, usually attribution. That's a big deal. The authors and contributors who can author this code must be attributed. But that's easier to manage than something like, hey, our proprietary code interacted with this open source code, and now we have an obligation to release everything that touched it, if you will, under an open source license. But on the permissive side, I'd like to, kind of like I did with GPL, accentuate a strategic thing that can be done with permissive licenses. So there's kind of risk avoidance, but if you're thinking about permissively licensed code at the outset of a project and why you might do that, there's a couple of good examples of companies releasing, entire products, if you will, under something like Apache or BSD or MIT licenses. And what tends to happen there is a lot of adopters or users feel very safe using that code or modifying it and contributing and participating basically in a very robust way, because there's very low risk that they can't pick and choose how they want to participate. And that can lead to really rapid adoption and network effects and lots of participation in a technical ecosystem. But the trick, the Machiavellian trick perhaps, is that you can change those. The same code that you release at some point in time under one of these permissive licenses, you can change the game later as the author and say, now that we have widespread adoption and a big ecosystem that we have our arms around, we can offer a new version that comes, it's basically the same code. It's under now a more restrictive license. It comes with more bells and whistles and monetize the heck out of it, or put other more soft constraints on the ecosystem. And I think that piece gets lost sometimes when companies are just thinking about, hey, can this stuff be in our products or not? As open source code becomes part of one's product ecosystem, it's useful to, even if you're not starting from scratch, to understand that there's real, business techniques and kind of strategies that can be deployed down the road if you need to. From that kind of strategic standpoint, looking ahead, have you heard any conversations or been a part of conversations like that about controlling ecosystems or leveraging open source licenses in ways that give you proprietary control? Maybe Indira, probably see these things a lot.
Yeah, I think, the strategy part of open source licensing is interesting, right? Because on one hand, you want to drive adoption, and to maximize adoption, you kind of are forced to license something as, under as permissive license as you can possibly do, right? Like a BSD or a MIT or an Apache, or sometimes what I've seen people do is the Creative Commons licensing suite, right? So that's also an interesting one where you can use the CC by NC license. So what that says is, it's a very permissive license, but then you cannot use the software for commercial purposes, right? So what that does is you're releasing under a permissive open source license, but you can't sell the software unless you have a licensing agreement with the author, right? So there are a couple of ways to do this. And I think the examples that we're seeing that you earlier brought up, Gabe, with MongoDB and recently the Elastic and Kibana, right? They all switched to the SSPL license. So that basically what that does is it's a proprietary license, right? It's not an open source license. So you start off with, driving adoption by open sourcing, and then you switch, and then you say, okay, now I'm going to monetize on this, and then this is actually a commercial license. So that is happening more and more these days, right? And that is in itself is a strategy, right? That's these companies are huge companies. They've got billion-dollar evaluations, right? So they started off as fully open sourced. I think MongoDB started off as this 10 gen many years ago that was completely open source, and they released under the Affero GPL license. And now, it's basically a commercial license.
Yeah, another strategy too is, there's the kind of change the game strategy as you go through time, either planned or maybe sometimes unplanned. But I think that probably the most paradigmatic open source business model is dual licensing. So if I'm the copyright holder and I create a piece of code on day one, I can offer that code both under an open source license of any type and simultaneously under a proprietary license for kind of regular royalties and licensing regime. And maybe it has extra bells and whistles or not, or different benefits. And that, can be a very strategic way to get the best of the developments from a huge developer community, widespread adoption, but hedge your risks through traditional modes of monetization through the proprietary licensing side. There's some great examples of that, Java and MySQL and probably other regimes as well. I think there's some sort of Linux related applications that take that approach as well.
I see stuff like that come up in particularly commercial uses where the dual licensor will make the code freely available for, let's say, an internal use or an individual's use. But when a large company wants to commercialize it in a product or a service or something, then the open source license may not be adequate. And that's when you have to look for the commercial license in order to get what you need.
Yeah, I mean, and without giving away state secrets, I can imagine that if it's late in the game and a well-intentioned engineer has built, that kind of code into a product, and time has marched on, and it maybe wasn't necessarily top of mind for everybody, but then the day comes when everybody becomes aware. Those could be probably, and I've seen them, hard conversations and hard decisions. Gosh, now that it's clear now that this is very important to our product, we face some risk if we keep doing what we're doing, maybe substantial risk, and we have a motivated economic actor out there with a commercial licensing program that would really allow us to safely do what we want to do. That's not a great negotiating posture for a company that's already using the code. So
I'll bet people come to you and utilize your services at that point, Gabe.
Thank you so much, Rudy. I appreciate that kind gesture. But at the same time,
mention the service model, that where the code base gets out there, but it's really complex, and these businesses that are making a lot of revenue by providing support for companies that need to use that open source base, and those companies, they don't really make their money on license fees. They make it on their expertise in implementing and maintaining the open source. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think Red Hat's probably the best example of that. It's really it's all like the licensing regime itself is all open source and purely GPL, but building an entire services ecosystem around it. But that's the kind of thing I think that needs to be planned quite early and executed from day one. It's less easy to do well if you're later in the game. Maybe shifting gears a little bit, just in our final few minutes here, beyond the types of things that we've talked about, what tangible, intangible value of open source that you've heard about or experienced from any of your perspective?
Well, I mean, I think from a cost perspective, particularly for early stage companies, utilizing open source effectively can be a cost saving measure, right? It can create efficiencies in development when companies are somewhat cash strapped. And so I think, that goes to, I think, the increased amount of open source components we're seeing in code bases. But but I think it also allows early stage companies to maybe get to market faster than they might have been able to in the past, when they might, weren't necessarily wanting to use open source because they feared investors wouldn't want to invest in a company that utilized a lot of open source. So they were spending a ton of money on engineers or developers that they might not necessarily need to do as much now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's also worth kind of considering. We tend to talk about open source and even particular license types as these monoliths, with these features, and I think at some level that's true. But if you understand the licenses and take stock of your technical ecosystem, you can pick and choose features. So I've seen companies, for example, it's not all one thing, right? It's not, and it's not as though you can't plan ahead and adjust. So I think that gets lost sometimes too. It's just a reductionist conversation. So I've seen companies open source, certain parts of their ecosystem under very restrictive licenses that there's a kind of deterrence feature. They want adoption, but they want to deter in a way folks from taking their code wholesale and taking the gamble to integrate it into other things. And that kind of deals with one category of competitors, but then they will open source, for example, like a client, and like an SDK, a software development kit that interacts with a platform or something under a very permissive open source license. So basically for users or application developers or those who you just want to make sure they're there and it's frictionless as possible. Those stakeholders get this, completely wide open license that is very safe to use, and it just drives tons and tons of scale, tons of app developers, tons of users, tons of partners in a way that's really valuable. But it's not one thing. That companies who really thought about it have said, okay, in this piece of the ecosystem, I want this strategic play, and over here, I want something that's a little safer. So, there's choices to be made, I think.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing these days is companies are using, as you guys earlier said, open source for hiring, right? So they're building great teams by, getting all these great open source developers that are out there and harnessing that talent, right? And using open source as, something that's like a great hiring tool. And oftentimes you find the best people out there, right? And I think the thing about open source is there's people who do great work, and like with everything that you do, you want recognition, right? And open source is it recognizes your work basically because everything is out there in public. So you're making contributions, you're right there. So it's visible, and that's one of the main, drawing points for open source is that it's freely available and you can use it, and people are using it in interesting ways these days.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Rudy and Michelle, both of you having had in-house experiences, often from the lawyer's point of view, at least in my travels, it's hard to build trust with engineering teams sometimes with their lawyers. It's seen as the zombies who are just going to kill everybody. But here is one place where if you're knowledgeable and you're kind of engaged and thoughtful about it, the lawyers can actually interact with the engineers and really build trust in a way that probably transcends open source per se. And so maybe make that as a suggestion, a thought point for all the lawyers on the call today. This can be your friend in terms of building human capital and relationships in your company.
I would say that in that regard, and I think this point was made by the others earlier, it's really important to know what we want to do with the code and how sensitive we think it is. And like if it's not sensitive at all, you make it widely available, but sometimes the code has no use outside of your own product or your own, and why not make it the most permissive, because then you're helping people that use your product. But if you can involve the engineers in that kind of discussion and guide them to make the decisions, legal guidelines so that they can make the business decisions on the engineering freedom of what goes in your code and the business cost freedom, yeah, you're going to be a trusted advisor, right? you're going to be not a deal killer. So some of the fun goes away, huh, Gabe?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic point. Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Rudy. I mean, to the extent you can, develop a rapport with your engineering team so they don't look at you as the department of no, but the department of let's do it and not get in trouble is, can be really effective, working with the team and effectively, sort of growing the company, but growing the product in the right way.
Excellent. Very good. I think it's been a great discussion today. Honestly, I think that's a terrific place to kind of close out our thoughts for today. Thank you all of you for participating. Thanks to the audience for your good questions. I just have one request of ACC, and that is if this video is published someplace, that it be released under an extremely permissive license so that all can see.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
We will do that for sure. We will be posting this up on our website. Thank you very much to Crowell and Mooring for participating and hosting this great discussion today, and to our panelists.